Welcome back to our Brihat Samhita study. Today we're looking at chapter 4, which is about the moon. And it has a similar outline as the chapter on the sun. It doesn't really talk that much about anything we're used to hearing astrologically about the moon, and it has a whole lot of new things that we're not used to hearing about the moon. So, to begin with, just to give you an overview of the chapter, the first section of the chapter talks about the moon relative to nakshatras, and the second section talks about how the moon looks, especially on the first visible day, the first day that it's visible after being new. So those are the two main sections in the chapter. And then there's a third section, which is about the moon eclipsing other planets. So there's three sections in this chapter. The moon relative to nakshatras, the appearance of the moon on the first day that you can see it, and the moon eclipsing other planets. So let's get into the first section right away. That is the moon relative to some nakshatras. What he says in this section is, let me scroll to that. Basically, the gist of what he says in this section is the general gist of, hey Yui, Sanjay, the general system for omens. Remember, I kind of explained the general system of omens is you notice something unusual. That's what an omen is, really. That's what divination is to pay it to. Actually, that's what anything is. You just notice something unusual when you're communicating with people, right? Oh, it's kind of unusual that they had that kind of a expression on their face when they said that. Yeah, Serena, all of the stuff gets saved on my channel, so you can watch it anytime. So what was I saying? That's basically how we communicate, is we look for unusual things. Unusual things catch our eyes. So when you're looking at nature, you look for an unusual thing. If you notice an unusual thing, you pay attention to it. The unusual thing will give you a hint about what's going on. So with the moon and the nakshatras, he's going to talk about as far as I understand it, he's talking about the declination of, I got something in my eye. He's talking about the declination of the moon. So declination means we're used to hearing about longitude, right? The a planet's east or westness. So you describe the longitude as like Aries, 1 degree, Aries 5 degrees, Taurus 6 degrees. But we're not as used to hearing about north or south position of the planet. Sorry, relative to the sun's plane. But what Varahamihira seems to be talking about is the moon's northerliness or southerliness when it enters into particular nakshatras. And it tends to have now this will depend. What he says here actually is only applicable to the centuries around with which he wrote this. Because as the equinoxes, now my astronomy here is not really so perfect, but I believe as the equinoxes precess, then the north node and the south node. Nah, that's not true. Yeah, that's not true. Actually, so the north node and the south node are the points where the moon crosses the ecliptic, has a zero declination. That's Rahu and Ketu. So anyway, here's what he says. He says, first of all, he just talks about the moon. The moon is closer, he says in the first statement. He says it's like inferior to the sun, below the sun. So in other words, by being inferior to the sun, it doesn't have light of its own. Hi, Sanjay, sister. The moon doesn't have light of its own, but it reflects the sun's light, he says. So because of that, it's just like if you held a round object up in the sun, some of the object gets bright and the other part of the object gets covered by its own shadow, right? So he says the moon is like that. He says the moon, which is fickle, which always changes its shape, reflects the sunlight into the nighttime, and so it gives some of the sunlight to the nighttime. And he says just like if you held up a mirror in the sunlight, you could then direct the sunlight into a place that was dark. So those are the first two shlokas, and then he goes on to talk about he says, so when the moon is conjoined, in the third sloka, he says, when the moon is conjoined to the sun, then you're just going to see black. You're not going to see the moon at all. When the moon is conjoined to the sun, because it's like if you held an object in front of the sun, you would not see any light on that object. You'd only see the shadow. Then the further the moon gets from the sun, the more it starts to be lit up. And he says it comes up from the bottom of the moon. So day by day, as the moon will get further and further away from the sun, and also more and more bright. That's what he says in 3:4. He says that's why the brightness of the moon increases, corresponding to the distance that it is from the sun. Okay, that's actually the first section. Sorry, I forgot to mention that in the overview of the chapter. So he's got this one section here that just explains the mechanics of why the moon changes its face. No, Rahu and Ketu are not some dust clouds. Rahu and Ketu are the points where the moon and the sun's path cross. It's simply what they are. It's like if you say, I think that Rahu and Ketu are actually dust clouds. It's like me saying, I think that Jupiter is not a planet. I think that it's a basketball. Okay, now we get to the second section of the chapter. The first section explains why the moon gets brighter and smaller. Because it's not making its own light, it's reflecting the sunlight, and then the angle between the sun and the moon determines how much of the thing is in shadow and how much is in bright. Then in Shloka 5, he starts to talk about the moon relative to nakshatras, and he's going to talk about the declination of the moon. I believe this is what he's talking about. He says, if you get the moon passing through certain nakshatras when it's in the southern declination, then that's not good. If you he goes through things like that. So he says if the moon passes through the south of Jeshta Mula and the Ashadas, then there's destruction. It's bad. Okay. And he says if the moon is south of Vishaka or Anuradha also, it's bad. But if it goes through the middle of Magha or Vishaka, then it's good. Now, I've read a comment from somebody, some translator, that said that Bhattopala, who writes commentaries on Varahamihira's works, but unfortunately nobody that I know of has translated these into English, and to read a commentary takes forever. But apparently Bhattopala explained that what Varahamihira is talking about here are things that are typically not possible. The moon typically never goes into these nakshatras in the southern declination. So these, like I said, this is the basic nature of omen, is you look for something which is unusual and then you interpret it. So apparently, although I don't know this astronomy, we're not familiar with these kind of things anymore. apparently the moon has an unusual relationship north or south of the nakshatra that it gets in. And then in the Shloka 7, he makes an interesting point. Which a lot of people actually have questions about. So here's a point that a lot of you guys have asked in the past, either to me or just other people. I see this question floating around a lot. The question is, what are the nakshatras, right? How are they related to stars? So the answer is, well, there's this thing called a principal star, a yogatara, which is the defining point of a nakshatra. So, for example, the Spica is the yogatara, the principal star for Chitra nakshatra. And the definition of Chitra nakshatra is, it's an unusual one, that Chitra is exactly in the star, Chitra, the Spica star, we call it Spica in modern astronomy, is exactly in the middle of that 13 degree 20 minute field called Chitra. And then based on that, you can set up all the rest of the nakshatras pretty easy. Or you can use another one and you can say Revati's yogatara, the primary star for Revati, which I think is Zeta Piscium, is 3 arc minutes or something shy of the border of the end border of Revati. So like that, that's how nakshatras are defined, by their angle from particular stars. And he makes the point, but now not every star that defines a nakshatra is actually in the nakshatra field. Some of them are a little bit before the field, some of them are in the field, and some of them are a little bit after the field. This is what he's talking about in Sloka 7. So in other words, like for example with Chitra, the I think off the top of my head I can't think of the other ones. But with Chitra, for example, it's smack in the middle of its field. But some of the other ones, I think Swati, that area, they're not in the nakshatra field. So what Varahamihira says is he's not talking about the star. So actually, I think this has even more meaning too. Is like the stars also have a lot of declination to them. They're not all on the ecliptic. Like for example, Swati is very far north, and Mula is very far south. Ah. Jeshta Mula and the two Asada, maybe he is talking about the stars. So he seems to be saying here in Shloka 7, he's not talking about the fields, but he's talking about the actual stars. And this would explain why it's very but Batotpal's comment, that it's very difficult, if not impossible, for the moon to be south of Mula or north of Swati and so forth. So the takeaway from this section is, if the moon travels past the yogataras of the nakshatras in unusual ways, then it's usually bad. But if the exception is if it's right in the middle of Magha or Vishaka. Anyway, this text, the reason why I'm studying this text with you guys is because it's very understudied, as you can tell. So even if we just bring these topics up to your attention, to be into the air for people to think about and start talking about, it's a good thing. Okay, any questions about that confusing stuff? Definitely the different nakshatras have different effects. But he doesn't talk about that here. Now he's going to go on to a new subject. He's talking about the horns of the moon, as this translator puts it, which is a weird way to translate it. the next section, he's got this technique where, I don't know, here in Japan they call it mikakan, the third day moon. And that's basically the first day that you can see the moon is the third. I think the first day is the new moon. The second day is not a new moon, but it's too close to the sun to really see it. The first day that you really notice the moon is the third day. At least in Japanese tradition, that's what they say. So, whenever you first can see the moon after its new moon conjunction, it's going to have these things called vishalata, which is, it's going to be a very crescent shape. It's going to look like your fingernail. And it's going to, it's going to have 2 points on the vishala, the two most extreme ends. That's what the translator is expressed as horns, or that's the vishalata. Now, what Varahamihira says is observe the horns of the moon, the 2 extremities of the points of the crescent moon. If they're nice and normal, then things are great. But if they're a little weird, then you got to make these different kinds of interpretations. Vishalata. Tini dakini. It's vishalata. It doesn't mean horn at all. It just means the expanses. Okay, so he's saying if the northern horn is higher than the southern horn by too much, by a lot more than usual, that's one way it could be unusual. In that case, he says, things become more moony, but it's not good for, things become more moony means people become more friendly with each other, kings especially, but agriculture suffers. I think it's because the plow is not being used. The moon has the shape of like a plow. And he says if you get the opposite, the southern thing is too high, then it's very bad. If the southern point of the moon is too high, then it's southern means lower. If the lower point of the moon is high, then it's really bad. If the 2 horns are even, then it's great. Now, there's another interesting point that I noticed in a commentary on this chapter, in a comment on this chapter, by a translator, is that some of the things here are not really things that you objectively find. Like he's going to say, what if it seems to be a new moon? What if I think this commenter might be wrong, but one commenter raised a point that some of the things might be just in the eye of the observer. They might not actually happen, like objectively. Somebody else might not see it. If you see it like this, then you have to make this prediction, and as it's going to affect you in your life. It's something to consider. So, continuing with the text. If the horns assume the shape of a stick, so I mean, that's one thing, like, what is that? This stuff should be illustrated. Once again, I got to say it. If you got the horns in the shape of a stick, you get disease amongst cattle, and you get your animals get sick. And the kings will be ruthless in meting out punishment. So stick is danda. Danda also means the rod, the punishing rod. Like a staff. Danda means a staff. Staff is used to hit things. So if the moon looks like a stick, looks like a staff instead of a crescent, then it means there's going to be a lot of punishment, and it's not so nice for animals. If it looks like a bow, which means that the crescent has like a line attaching them, then there's going to be war, and the victor of the war are the people who are on the string end of the bow, in the country that or people that's in the direction of the string end. So you see, actually, the stuff is very simple. What he's talking about is real simple stuff. It's just like you notice something unusual, you look at the image of it, and then you interpret the image. If it's a stick, that means that people are using the rod. There's a lot of punishment. Rods are used on animals. Also, you direct the animal with the rod. If it's a bow, it means people are fighting. Who's going to win? Not the guy that's on the end that the arrow is pointing at, the guy that's on the end that the string is on. So it's very simple, and he's just going through lots and lots of specific examples to illustrate it. He says there's going to be an earthquake if the moon appears stretched out. If the crescent seems to be stretched out. So he goes through various... Oh, this is an interesting one. If one of the horns... Oh, wow. If the moon is like tipped over so that one point's down, then it's terrible. If the horns of the moon should together appear like a circle, it's called kunda, and the ruling chiefs in the land will be ousted from their places. So this happens. I've seen this one before. It's where you can actually kind of see the shape. I've seen some of these things before. Okay, so the bow is when you get the moon. You can see a crescent, but you can also see distinctly that one side of the moon is definitely a crescent. But the other side, you could just faintly see like it almost just is like a tiny line on the other side of the moon. You can see that the moon is a circle if you look carefully. That's probably the bow. And then the other one, and so the string side of the bow is the one that's just a tiny little line. And then this other one, kunda, is where the whole thing just looks like kind of an eclipse. You can see the moon is new, but the moon is like blank, but it's just like an empty circle. You can see a faint line of a circle. That's called kunda. In the case that you see that, then the kings and the governors and all that get changed. This is what he says. Yeah, kunda means pond. Any circular thing can be called a kundala, earring. Let's see some of these. He's just going on and on and on about different shapes. Now he says there's other shapes besides the horn things. He wants to talk about other things. He says sometimes the moon looks really small. That's not good. And sometimes it looks really big, and that's very good. So what he says is when the moon looks like it's too small, then you predict that there's not going to be enough food or wealth. And when the moon looks bigger than it's supposed to look, then predict that there's going to be more wealth. Try it. See what happens, because now we have this, we can keep pretty good track of it when the moon is closer and further away from the earth. When it's closer, it's going to actually look a bit bigger, and when it's further away, it's going to look a bit smaller. It's very slight. It moves very slightly, and so the difference is very slight. So you could keep track of it and see when they always post on social media about the supermoon and all that stuff. So that's when the moon is looking a bit bigger. See if stocks increase and stuff at that time. And if it does, then let's all get rich. So what else? So if the moon looks a bit small, then it's not good for wealth and agriculture. If it looks bigger than usual, it's good for wealth and agriculture. If it's slender in the middle, so this is deformed. This is where the person gave a comment that some of these things must be visual in your eye. If it's slender in the middle, it's termed Vajra, which means a lightning bolt, and indicates risk to people from hunger and war. So there's like danger if it's slender in the middle. To me, I think he's talking about the full moons here now. So this is, the full moon is like not quite, if the circle is deformed a bit. Yeah. Okay. Like a hammer. So this stuff is so out of practice that it's really difficult to know what he's talking about. I wish we could invite him on to the channel. That would be amazing. Well, let's see what else he says. How much time have we been doing this? Wow, it's already been 26 minutes. He's going to also talk about the moon eclipsing other planets. And he talks about it in two ways. One is when the moon, if the moon is still crescent and it eclipses another planet, then it seems to be stabbing them or cutting them, slicing them. Versus if the moon is just another shape. So first he talks about moon eclipsing other planets while it's crescent. If Mars gets eclipsed like that, then then it's bad for bad guys. If Mars gets eclipsed, it's bad for violent people. So it's good if Mars gets eclipsed by the crescent moon. If Mars gets cut by the crescent moon. If it is Saturn, then it's not good. It's like in the opposite way. People get scared, particularly. They feel scared and hungry. If it's Mercury, then you get lack of rainfall. If it's Jupiter, then a lot of important people have troubles. If it's Venus, then like Venus and Jupiter is kind of the same. The important people get affected badly if Venus or Jupiter get eclipsed by a crescent moon. If it's Jupiter, it's like the moral and spiritual leaders, and if it's Venus, it's like the secular leaders. These effects will be mild and partial if the moon be in the bright half. If she be in the dark half, the effects are worse. That's what he says. Then he says if you get the moon not just like slice past the planet. Okay, so it might not just be the crescent is cutting, but if the moon like slices a planet, like goes right by it. So that would mean this has to do with the declination. Let's take the example of Mars. If Mars is here and the moon is here, the moon just kind of slices past it, versus a full eclipse, which is like Mars is here, here's the moon. So now he's going to talk about a full eclipse down the middle. The way that he talks about this is that the different planets being eclipsed affect different types of people. And it's difficult to translate this into modern thing because he talks about the stuff that was the political borders and things that were active in his day and age. But he says if you get Venus, it affects certain people. It's not good for that planet. Basically, let's take this away from it. A planet being eclipsed by the moon is not good for that planet. Venus he associates with Magadhas, Yavanas, Pulindas, Nepalis, etc. Jupiter he associates with Gandharva people, which is a country, not those angels. Sindhu, Kira, and Dravidians. So it's very difficult to know what these people were like. But I think it would be easiest to just say, if the moon eclipses Venus, then Venusian people suffer from that. If it eclipses Mars, etc., then Martial type people suffer. If the moon goes over Ketu, you get a lot of thieves. And you get bad health. So like that. And then we can end up this chapter in one session. He says, here's other things. So far we said, in this chapter he explained why the moon gets bigger and smaller. If you need to, you can watch the replay of this video. He explained why the moon gets bigger and smaller. He explained the moon being too far south or too far north than expected, or being right on point in relation to the yogatars of the nakshatras. He explained the shape of the moon when it arises from conjunction, when it comes into its first crescent, and you can interpret the shape of that moon in different ways. He explained the shape of the full moon, unusual things in the shape of the full moon. He explained when the moon eclipses other planets. Now he's going to finish up the chapter by just talking in a couple of things just about the moon in general, the way it looks. And what he says is, if the moon isn't very bright, then that's not good. We want the moon to be bright. So if the moon looks dirty and reddish and doesn't really shine, that's a bad omen. But if the moon is super bright and looks really wonderful, then that is beautiful. We love that. It means peace and prosperity. Okay? Then, during the bright half, if the growth is regular, then Brahmins and Kshatriyas and people in general are happy and get better. If her growth is medium, if it's less than me, I don't know what this is talking about. Some of the things are hard to say. What does it mean that the growth is not regular? How could it not be regular? The moon progresses by a certain amount every day on a clockwork. So I don't understand the 31st shloka, how he's talking about. I know what he's talking about. The way that you calculate the tithis, which are the phases of the moon in relation to the sunrise. If you're skipping sunrises or losing sunrises, or if you're skipping the tithis, the lunar phase days, or if you're elongating some, that must be what he's talking about. So during the bright moon, we always like regular growth. I don't know. I would have to study this sloka. It's very, very cryptic. I would say probably what he's saying is, if you're skipping days, elongating the days during the bright fortnight, it's good. And if you're truncating the lunar days during the bright fortnight, it's bad. And the reverse is true in the dark half. That's my working thesis for what he means in Sloka 31. Sloka 32, which is the final one, he says, the moon leads to victory and prosperity to everybody in the world when she is as bright as kumuda flower and pearls. And when her phases increase in sync with the tithis. And so that when she's steady and on course and everything is nice and she's nice and bright, that's what we want. So this Sloka 32 actually is more useful than you think, because it's saying everything that we basically talked about in this chapter is exceptions to this, where the moon is not in sync with the tithis, the phases are not going along with the way that the sunrises are working, and she doesn't really quite look healthy or right or bright. All right. That's the chapter on the moon. At least that's our first look at the Brihat Samhita's chapter on omens of the moon. Next chapter, believe it or not, is not Mars or Mercury. It's Rahu. So tomorrow we'll take a look at what Varahamihira has to say about Rahu. Okay, guys, I'm going to now skip off and start up the Bhagavatam stream, where we're going to see the stages of Bhakti Yoga and how it progresses. So I don't think you hang around for that. I think you have to actually get off this one and then look for the next one to start. Thanks, everybody. See you in a few minutes, I hope.